Hey there. I'm here with Signe Jung Sorensen, and we're going to talk about compassion today. We're going to talk about compassion and how it plays with the impact that we here want to make in the world, and the role that it plays not just with this idea of external compassion, but internal compassion as well. And I wanted specifically to bring in Signe to this conversation because it's been on my mind. And I've known Signe for over a year now. And when I first met her, um, she had this incredible passion and value of exploring compassion. Signe is a coach and a compassion explorer. She works with the social impact scene, with those working in social impact, with organizations and social impact, with individuals in social impact. And she's been studying compassion for years now. And what I love about her is that she explores compassion through conversations, through how we're showing up, through organizations. And I wanted to get her on and explore compassion with us in the impact space. And I know that it's something that she's been exploring. When I first met her, she was actually doing a study on compassion and pulling together interviews with people who are in the impact space. And I love to hear more about that. So welcome today. That was a really long introduction, but I'm really excited to have you on.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was a very warm introduction. It's lovely to be here.
So I know that you have a hypothesis around compassion. And, I wrote down a little, bit about that, but can you tell us a little bit about what that hypothesis is and the three ways of compassion that you feel are sustainable? This is a big thing in the impact space, right? So many of us have this compassion that drives us to do the work that we want to do. But there's more to it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think my hypothesis stemmed from these interviews and speaking with these people that I started 2 years ago. And I sort of realized that when people talk about the role that compassion plays on their impact journeys, they'll tend to talk of it from three different perspectives. To me, it made a lot of sense. So the three sort of perspectives that would most come up would be the compassion that we have externally for the problem we want to solve, right? The big poverty or the ocean pollution, or we feel the pain of other people out in the world and we want to help. Sort of a very external driven, and that can actually work as an anchor on our impact journeys, because we can center, this is why I'm doing all this hard work. It's because of this.
It's this big focus. And I think you called that, I think you nailed it too. I read something that you wrote, about, did I write it down? That compassion supports our why, centering ourselves, right?
Exactly.
And our impact. And what I, wrote down too was that it really helps us to focus. That's absolutely.
Exactly. A little bit like, or another word I choose for is the North Star, right?
Yeah.
The guiding star of the impact that we ultimately.
Anchoring is a really good word for that.
Yes. Yeah. And I realized that when people spoke, this is actually why I got into the sector. This is actually why I started this foundation. And then it is easy to get sidetracked from that when we're 5 or 10 years in, or even at the beginning.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about, that's why I started this. Okay.
Right.
It's like a calming element. It's a grounding element. And the second perspective that people talk quite a lot about in these conversations is that the way that they then get there to this big why, that compassion also plays a role there. So this might be in how they relate with other colleagues or with managers, or even how they think of going in and serving the people that they want to be serving.
Mm-hmm.
That compassion is also an important element in that process. So sort of aligning, I guess, the really embedding the value of compassion, not just out there, but also in the process.
Yeah. And, you know, just as a side note, you and I share a love of values. And I mean, you know, it's been this called my anchor, right? But we're really talking about so much of the same thing. And I don't want to sidetrack us because I know you have the third, you know, piece. And I have like a knack for going down rabbit holes. So I'm going to stay focused. But I just wanted to kind of put a little pin, you know, down the road in our conversation about how values interlock or overlap. There's maybe two different terms that may mean the same thing or something different, but with how values connect with compassion. So pin in that for after, but
yes, and a great point. And also, before I get to the third point, I would say that that link right there is a really interesting link between the compassion, something that people are very passionate about talking to me about, that they feel that the value that they're driven by in the world, then they get confused or frustrated when that value isn't immediately, you know, in the immediate surroundings, which is an interesting observation. Of not feeling necessarily the value while we're in the process of doing something very compassionate for the world. And it's a source of a lot of frustration and overwhelm and etc. Which then brings me to the third aspect, the third and final way of thinking about compassion that people are talking about is bringing that compassion home to ourselves in the process. Interestingly, the point that people talk the least about, and it's often only when I prompt and say, oh, have you thought about compassion for yourself? No. Because as change makers or people who are driven by social impact, it's so easy to focus on everything externally, and a lot harder or easy to forget to bring that compassion home.
If I had to guess, you know, of the three there, you know, the most damaging in, you know, lacking and also just not having awareness of that, you know, it's like the iceberg, right? You know, that compassion outwards, not the problem, right? We may need some education around how to apply compassion productively. And this is, you know, I know this is like a really meaty place, you know, and somewhere that, you know, you've been exploring like immensely, right? Is applying compassion productively. And it's so relevant, you know, I think to this impact space. But the unrecognized space below the water there is that self-compassion. And we invest in so many things as entrepreneurs, as change makers. And I bet you that most of us are not investing enough in self-compassion. That capacity, it's a capacity element. It's a huge capacity element.
It is a really, really big element. And what both studies are showing, and also just, I think maybe a bit of sort of common sense would also show, is that if we don't do that, like if we don't turn it inwards, then for sure our compassion externally, whether it's an organizational team or for the big why, that will be unsustainable. And we will at some point be very overwhelmed or maybe experience a burnout too.
Yeah.
So that's why the hypothesis is that you would need all three to some extent for that compassion to be sustainable.
Yes.
Or endured.
And sustainable too. So let's talk about what sustainable means, right? So sustainable compassion. Do you also believe that? So let's draw the lines, because you're a big map person and I'm a big visual, you know, mapping person as well. So do you believe that to make a big impact in the world, these three elements of compassion, these three arms or three components of compassion need to be developed?
It's a good question. I think you can do a lot of impact with just one of them. Like, you know, I do think you can have impact focusing. If I take my own journey as an example in that social impact space, I think for a long time I was just focusing only on the big why, and doing that. And I do think that people can have a tremendous amount of impact just focusing on that.
I think people start. I mean, that's where the impetus generally happens, right?
Yes, it's the entry point, right?
Yeah.
And then I think sort of over time, depending on when that time is, it felt like I needed to get two others to feel that I could, I would say this, actually sort of protect that compassion that got me into that sector in the first place.
Right.
That I would need more to sustain it.
Yeah, because
And so
otherwise
I
you're
think
burning out and you're not,
exactly,
and you're
exactly.
full of frustration. So there's burnout and frustration, and there's overlap there. But that burnout, I think, generally comes in, you know, in the form of not knowing how to tackle the second piece. You know, it's, if we're not actively aligning, just like with values, right? If we're not actively aligning to the how piece with compassion, just like the how piece with values. And I want to talk about, we still need to like dive into that because we may be losing people.
Sure.
What's the connection between values and compassion? You know, compassion a value for some people, right? And by value, I mean like top value. For all change makers, compassion is a value, right? It's there, it's present, it almost inherently there, right? But we have this like above the line idea of what our top values are, and they're like our big drivers of how we show up. So what does that mean? But this will burn out, right? We won't, it's not sustainable, just like you said, right? For sustainable impact, we need sustainable compassion.
Exactly. That's exactly it. I think you can have impact for a while without the all roots of compassion that map, but ultimately you will need them all three.
Yeah, I agree. I think so too.
Yeah, that's my hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay, so values. And then I want to ask you, you know, what does that functionally look like? Like what, you know, how do I actually build compassion into my life? And what does that look like for entrepreneurship, you know, in your opinion, and for making an impact? So values first, though.
Values first. Can you repeat them?
Okay, so you know, much like values in, you know, that second piece. So specifically the second piece of that, about how we can functionally bring compassion into how we show up in the world and how we make that impact, right?
Yeah.
You know, the first piece is that looking outward, right? It's my why, right? I see this problem. I have, you know, immense compassion for solving this big problem. It's really important to me. You know, I want to do something about that. And that's that driver. And then that second piece, right, is the how. How does, and it's the same application of values. So tell me how you see the interplay between compassion and our values, and what's the overlap?
Got you. I think this is kind of also where I am at exploring, right, with people, and to try and get more and more concrete about, so what does this look like in practice, and what does it look like in practice in your team if you have one? What does it look like in your project or maybe in your enterprise, right? What does that look like?
Yeah.
And I would say that through the conversations I've had so far, it seems that 80% of the way to get there is to just have the conversation, right? Is to be aware that, oh, of course I need to embed this value in the how. And some people actually sit down quite systematically and look at, what does this mean? Like anything from how we treat our beneficiaries, to how we have our meetings, to how we like onboard new employees, how our relations with our funders or investors. It's actually in all those levels. And what I'm now learning about is that one of the best ways of embedding compassion in the how is to make it part of the routines.
Yeah.
Like it's not something that we then think of later, or we sort of embed them in the way that we speak to people, or hold meetings. Yeah.
Yeah. And just in this, it's, it becomes like a solid piece of, this is how we do things here, right? So
Exactly.
culture, but, just like building it into every element, like actually built into the process of how we deliver whatever we deliver to the world. I love that, right down to how we run meetings and how our team acts and behaves with each other, to how we deliver our product, or we talk to our investors, or those relationships that we have, when they become these tangible elements of how we operate, as individuals within a group, as teams, and as an organization as a whole.
Exactly. It's about, and I love it. There's a wonderful woman who's written this book about awakening compassion at work, and she talks about really how do we get compassion into how we solve the problems,
Yeah.
so that it doesn't become,
Oh,
it's not about solving a problem and then we'll get to compassion afterwards and we'll treat our staff nice and we'll give them well-being retreats. And it's how can we have compassion in the way that we solve the problem. And I wish I had a concrete example or case study. I don't have that yet, but I'm very curious to see what that actually looks like in the impact space.
I think curiosity is just foundational to having compassion.
Absolutely.
I mean, if we stay curious, which is not easy to do all the time, and you know, I think it's a challenge. I think, but curiosity is one of the core. It's got to be one of the core behaviors, right? Or a lead to a behavior that sits with compassion.
Yes, and now that we're talking about it, I realize that a lot of the people eventually, when I interview people, oh, so what's the behavior you associate with compassion in your organization? Like, what's the actual for you? What is that?
Right.
And almost ultimately, everyone will at some point mention vulnerability, and within that, they will say something about recognizing failure and talking about failures in your group or
Yeah.
with yourself or whatever your project looks like. So that definitely curiosity, but also that level of vulnerability and talking about failures. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a demonstration of compassion in itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's big. So, is compassion a value, or is it a lot more than a value? How does how do you see, and I don't expect, I don't know if you have an answer to that. I don't know if we, values are weird, fuzzy things. Um,
They are.
for you, it showed up at first as a value, right?
It definitely showed up first as a value, but it also showed up as something when I first heard the word, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. I think I connected to it not necessarily as a value, but more as a, oh yeah. That kind of, that's actually a word that makes sense to me, because the word can be applied both externally and internally. And I think irrespective of whether we think it's a value or a behavior or whatever it is, I definitely think that it makes sense. Well, to me, it makes most sense to talk about compassion when we can talk about it in context and it becomes a tangible thing. I think that's where it has most potential.
Yeah. I feel like it's a catalyst, right? Or an amplifier.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if they have the right word, but that it's a multiplier. It's like it's a lens of sorts.
I think it's actually a lens. I think that's a rightly put. And I think a lot of, sometimes you might come to the same conclusions around these things without even naming it compassion. Could be that you started out talking about vulnerability or
Sure.
or a different thing. So I also just think it's a way to bring in this conversation around all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Kind of like a place to start exploring.
What's your bigger vision for the work that you're doing around compassion? Is that, you're a compassion explorer, right? And this is something that you've invested a lot of your time, and I imagine will continue to invest a lot of your time studying. What's your vision for what you hope this understanding of compassion will bring for you?
Hmm.
in your work?
Yeah, in my work. Well,
Well, your
I,
work, but your work is the work of, the organizations that you're working for. What's your, and I guess the question is, what is your vision for what this work, the work of building awareness and capacity around, our compassion in this, in these three levels of compassion? What happens when we can really tap into that in a broader way?
mm, well, to me, it ultimately comes down to believing that if we are connecting with this compassion, we're looking at it from these different lenses, that we would make that impact that we're all hoping to make, and still experience well-being and thriving in the process. That's for me ultimately the goal, because everyone benefits when that happens.
Thriving in the process.
Yeah. I very much think, and that is my vision for all this compassion work as I continue doing it, that it's almost a way of going inwards to go outwards and then to go inwards again. It's like one way to keep playing between the inner and the outer world.
Simon Sinek has a kind of analogy, for that as a slingshot. And that's immediately what I thought of, with that, like if you're, you can pull from the inside and really develop that internally, it creates this outward tension or outward resistance. I don't remember
Mm-hmm.
what, but anyway, that, then we can actually launch forward with, but it's this momentum. Um, and that implies that there are these one-shot deals that we have with it, which doesn't apply here, because what you're talking about is sustainable, the sustainable
Right.
energy to bring capacity or compassion out there to.
It is, and I actually think that if you do make compassion, well, I could do it for myself, which is hard, by the way. But if I center compassion around everything that I do, if I make that commitment to come back to compassion every time, it then also continues to hold me accountable,
Mm.
both in how I am doing internally and the work I'm committed to externally. So it's for me also an anchor of accountability,
Mm.
watching what's happening
You really love
across
that.
both
And
realities.
I think you're right. And I wonder how many, much like my drive to have more change makers get the clarity to move forward so that they can take action. My whole thing is that, if we don't have the capacity to articulate our impact, we can't take action on it.
Mm-hmm.
Much like for that to be true, how much is lost right at the next level? Like how much impact in the world gets stalled out and fizzles away because they just don't have the investment in all of those pieces of compassion and get burnt out, and then don't feel like they're the ones that have the capability of bringing this big work into the world. If I can't sustain this, and do people get to the point where they get, because they haven't developed, at the very least, that you know third stage of compassion, self-compassion, begin to fully doubt that even their investment in that external compassion, the reason that they started this in the first place, was really meant to be there for them.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. It's another hypothesis, but that self-compassion, right, is in some ways it keeps coming back to that, because it's probably the hardest one to cultivate,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you want to do something externally, and the most important one
And if you
when
don't
you're
structure it, oh, sorry.
no, it's like the most important. Another word for it could almost be resilience, right? Or not being scared of failure,
Right.
or because if when you do go out and want to have these big visions, there are going to be bumps in the road, and so the self-compassion is there to pick you up along the way as well.
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So what are some ways that we can start to build on, number two and number three? Presumably everybody listening to this, has got number one in the bag, give or take, right? But how do we start to structurally build in compassion, in our work, and then also build self-compassion? And that's a loaded question, and maybe it's only a tip or two, because it's a big body of work, right? And
That
I
is
know
a
it's something that you
huge
do in your
body of
coaching.
work. It is something I do in the one-on-one coaching. I do it a lot around, bringing in that, noticing the critical voice that we all have and working with that.
Yep.
And sort of introducing on our board of directors in our brain, a compassionate board member who's
I like
always
that
there.
idea.
But how can we make their voice maybe equally heard to
Mm-hmm.
the critical one, and how can they talk together? That's a very tangible thing that I do. But to your question, I mean, that is why a lot of the compassion work I do in my groups is a little bit experiment focused, and I call them experiments because, I mean, let's try and figure it out. Like, let's try and see what happens, especially when people bring like a concrete problem or something, and we look at it from different angles.
The group that you do, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the compassion community calls, I call them, it kind of sprung out from the interviews that I did, and I think people were like, okay, but what now, Signe? And I was like, well, I don't know what now, but let's continue having this conversation. And they've kind of evolved over the last 5-6 months into more of a community of support for women in particular who are working in the social impact industry. And so we'll kind of talk about compassion. Sometimes I will also test tools on them, or to see, is it something that lands, or is it something that
Oh, cool.
resonates or not.
So in the notes for this interview, if it's okay with you, I'll let people know how they can get in contact with you to be a part of that next. You said they're monthly?
Yeah, I host them twice a month, but I might open up I want to keep them quite small. Yeah. So it might be a case of starting another one.
Yeah. So, don't worry, I'll include a way to get in touch with Signe to be a part of that, if that's something you're interested in. I love that. And I wish I had known about them before. I haven't been as active on actually reading through social media, so I've missed it. I'm looking forward to that.
No, that's great. Yeah, and yeah, so just to respond to your question, which was a very loaded question, right? How do we do this link, both in the how and for ourselves? And I actually think there is a warranted place to start from ourselves as well, because I see it in the compassion community calls, the tools that we then test out. If a person resonates with it, they will then actually try and bring it into their team. And that's then an immediate link into how we are compassionate in our workplace as well.
Right. How do we build this in?
So if, that's definitely one way.
Yeah, because, so much of the frustration comes from these expectations that we have of the people in the process around us. And, even if we've got this bigger vision and this bigger idea of what our impact is going to be in the world, right? That driver for us and compassion, number one. If we're not structuring it, it's not productive. We'll spin our wheels, just like with values, in the coaching I do. If we don't structure how we do things, we're not going to continually align to our top values. Our niche shares our top values. And if we're just kind of like shooting darts at the wall and kind of hoping that, the way that we do things or the people that we surround ourselves with, share those top values, it's the same thing with compassion. So if you don't structure compassion into, those teams that work that all of those interactions, then you're not going to be continually experiencing compassion around you. You're not exuding compassion consistently, and you're not receiving it. And so it's important that we receive compassion too, and that we experience compassion daily around us.
Yes, I couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. I know I 100% agree with that. And I think that's also what leads to, in my personal story, as well as I hear in a lot of other people in the sector, it's almost like after the overwhelm or the burnout has been there, then we realize, oh, it was because of that misalignment of my compassion value. It was, I thought I was actually working with it, but then it wasn't around me, or it didn't feel like it was actually present. Yeah. So it's greater alignment. I think that's
it's just so important. And I think it's so important, for our capacity as entrepreneurs and as change makers to build this capacity. And so I hope that, if you're listening to this, that you'll join Signe in one of these groups, and let's all experience and build this in a more structured, sustainable way. And there's a way to do that. It's not just this thing that drove us at one point and that we sporadically try to integrate into our life that's so important to us. But if we're not actually, if we're not creating channels for it, then we're not living in compassion. So your work is so important, and I'm really encouraged by it. I'm really encouraged by it because we can learn it and we can build it in, instead of it just being this, that's wonderful, we should be compassionate people, right? And even knowing like I should be compassionate for myself, but if we can start to understand how to do that in a more structured way, then as leaders, as entrepreneurs, as change makers, we can build it in. I keep saying, like, it's a process, not a gift. It's a process, not a gift. And we have to build our capacity, internal and external capacity. And this is a huge piece of that internal capacity. So, and external capacity, it's both.
And I like that thing that of it becoming structured, right? It demands attention, and it demands conversations, and
it's important.
And it's important. And I often like to use the word as well, compassion DNA, that it becomes the DNA of everything that you do as a change maker.
Yep. I think that to really make an impact, I really believe that, that sustainable compassion will allow for sustainable impact. So I think that I think they go hand in hand, and we can't ignore building capacity around compassion.
No, I like that. And just for anyone listening who might feel overwhelmed, I get this quite a lot in my, respondents. Oh no, now I also have to be more compassionate. Like I have so many things on my plate already, and oh my God, now and then what I usually say is, I don't necessarily think it's about having more compassion.
Right.
I think it's more about connecting with the one that we have. So it's already there. It's just connecting with it. It's not something that you need to, to develop more of necessarily.
Thank you for that. Thank you for adding that point on, because you're right. Like, you're absolutely right. And it ultimately will make our lives easier and flow more naturally towards what we're going for.
Definitely. That's the ambition. It would make you feel better.
Yeah, right.
Rather than
and freer, and less stress, and less burnout, and thrive. And that's a word that you used, right? And thrive in the process. So if we're interested in thriving in the process as we create our impact, and actually want to make a sustainable impact and continue to do it, this is the pathway to that.
Yes. Well, that's definitely what I believe.
Yeah, I believe it too. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And I'll include, in the notes too, other ways that people can connect with you, because I know you've written a bunch of stuff, and you have your coaching practice, you do organizational consulting and coaching. So if your organization, is looking to bring compassion, that compassion work structurally into the work that they're doing, reach out to Signe. If you're looking, to coach personally on that, I'm going to try to convince her to help us do some work in the accelerator. She's a busy woman, but I'm going to try.
Not too busy for that.
Join a circle. I know I'm going to. But I've so appreciated you taking the time to sit with us in compassion and share your work with us.
Oh, thank you, Miss. And thank you for, it's really through conversation that I get excited about these things.
Me too.
So thank you for making me feel very excited about continuing the journey.
Good. It's needed. All right.
Okay.
I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Melissa.
Bye.
Bye.